on the program, it says that I'm talking on a new paradigm for nutrition research in low and middle income countries. I will talk about some of that, but the main point I want to make is that some of the challenges that Nutrition Third World has been trying to address, as Patrick really mentioned, are still with us. But there are some opportunities that we can look to, and as we look forward, I think some of those would become important. This is the University of Ghana campus. This is where I work, and I have been working there for the past 12 years. And my research is mainly in infant and young child feeding, and also recently, I'm beginning to work a lot more in food environments. But I cut across multiple aspects because I'm also in the Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health, so I cannot get away from reproduction. I would first start off by saying that, the world we live in now has multiple challenges. And if you've stopped watching TV, sometimes it's because of that reason, that there are issues with the environment. I think this week environment has been on the news. There are also issues with, here in Europe, I believe you're talking about Brexit a lot. There are issues with poverty, and all these things, some way, somehow, are linked. But in my work, and for many of us here, we think about nutrition and its link with people's well-being. There's an aspect of it that we usually think about when we think of Africa, and that is hunger. And we live in a world currently where about 11% of people are considered by the FAO as hungry. In Africa, that is about 20%. And there are real numbers behind it. So this is about 256 million people. And it probably helps us to understand the scale of malnutrition that we deal with, but it's just a part of it. The Global Nutrition Report that came out in 2018 shows that we have not just one kind of malnutrition, but that there are multiple forms of malnutrition that the world is currently dealing with, and that no country is exempt from that. Every country around the world, developed and undeveloped, we all are facing one kind of malnutrition or the other. And then the malnutrition that we are facing also tends to focus a lot more on the most vulnerable people, women, children. And what is actually challenging is the fact that this malnutrition has been persistent and not declining as fast as we would expect it to do. And so issues of anemia in women and children, and now also moving into issues of overweight and obesity, which is becoming probably the most prominent face of malnutrition around the world, is something that we have to deal with. And I'm mentioning this because there are important drivers in our lifestyle, in the way we live, in the way we work, in the way we interact with each other. And we see important changes happening in our food environment, in our food systems, that drive these forms of malnutrition. And I'm just showing these just to give us a picture of what the situation is, and we may not be able to have time to look at the details of it. But all in all I'm trying to do is to bring us to this very important graph here that shows that in many countries around the world, there are actually multiple forms of malnutrition that our countries have to deal with. And there are only a few countries that have just one kind of malnutrition. There's usually an overlap of different kinds of malnutrition. And I take this picture from a report that was published by the NEPAD in 2016, and that looked at the nutrition situation in Africa specifically, again, we see that many of the countries have multiple forms of malnutrition. There are a number of things this suggests to us. We cannot use the same approaches that we have always used to be able to be successful in addressing malnutrition, but also that we have to be smarter in the way we deal with these, the different forms of malnutrition. And also the fact that in many countries, we are not actually doing very well in moving countries towards addressing malnutrition. Now, having said that, I think it's also helpful to present the situation in the country where I work. That's where I know the most about. So I'll talk about Ghana. And in Ghana, one of the things that we've been very fortunate to experience in the last few years is that stunting, which is one of the World Health Assembly's key indicators for monitoring malnutrition, has been declining quite significantly. In the past 10 years, it has declined from about 28% to 19%. And currently, I'm involved in a study trying to understand what is responsible for this change. But despite that trend, we see that still a little under 20% of children are stunted. And then when we look at anemia in women and children, although there has been some decline, especially in maternal anemia, child anemia is still high, about 66% from the latest nationwide study survey shows about 66% are still anemic. Again, we still have a lot of work to do on that. Low birth weight in children has not really declined much. For the last decade, it's been the way it is. And then the area that I spend a lot of my time is in breastfeeding. And in Ghana, the situation is that almost everybody breastfeeds, except that we don't breastfeed the way it's recommended. So that also requires us thinking through how do we bring about the change that we desire. And I can't end by talking about also overweight and obesity. Whilst we are trying to address the undernutrition, overweight and obesity is really growing rapidly. And this is data for women showing rate of overweight and obesity. In fact, in the city that I live in, Accra, the rate is 50%. So what is government's response? And not just in Ghana, but I just wanted to highlight that in Ghana, as part of the study that I'm doing right now to try and understand, shows that there are systemic challenges. One of those is the fact that we have our nutrition program being run by a nutrition department that is in the Ministry of Health, but it doesn't have enough power to convene other partners because nutrition is not just a health issue. And so it's been implementing programs, but usually limited to nutrition-specific interventions, dietary, health, service-related. To make matters worse, its budget line, it's also very small. It depends on what is given to the Ministry of Health, and therefore it doesn't really have a clear budget line to work with. As a result of that, most of the nutrition interventions are actually promoted by external donors. And now Ghana is a lower middle income country. It's hard to go and ask for donor money to support nutrition programs. And then there's not enough human capacity to be able to implement nutrition programs around. And then there's a lot of focus on undernutrition, and I showed you overnutrition. It's increasing rapidly. How do we solve these challenges? Fortunately for me, it's these guys who are supposed to do it, the politicians. They have the biggest headache on this. But I think that in my case, the bringing research to it is probably the contribution that I can make. Last year, this report was published by the Society for Implementation Science and Nutrition, pointing to some areas that we need research in to be able to address these nutrition issues. They are around the interventions that we implement, policies. So these are called the objects of implementation. But then there are also other areas related to the environment within which nutrition interventions occur, even around the implementation processes, but also within the communities that we serve. And usually the funders who fund research usually would focus on these to identify what interventions. And there's a whole area that is missing about how do you make the implementation actually work. And so for me, this is where I make a case that we need to be better at implementing local research. Again, getting at what the two previous speakers talked about. How do we get local research to answer the local needs for the countries? Now, I'll spend the next part of my presentation talking about what are the challenges that we face in my part of the world on nutrition research. The context that I would like to set for this is the fact that research from Africa compared to other continents is really small. If you look at it from the perspective of publications, it's just a very small part of it. And then also those who are involved in research compared to other continents, again, it's still a very small part of what is produced globally, although that has been increasing over time. And then I think an important part of it that we need to face up is that when you look at capacity of research institutions in Africa, it still has a long way to go. I mean, this is the World University Rankings, and the best performing African institution is ranked around 156. I mean, that gives us an idea of how much road we need to cover. So then I ask, what then is happening? What is happening when it comes to nutrition research? It appears that only a few countries in Western and Southern Africa are the most productive when it comes to nutrition research. And this is work done by Carl, who is here, and those in the Sunray project. And that the research is typically focused on fixing undernutrition using technologies, and does not often look at some of the preventive interventions. In many cases, as has been mentioned already, it's led by authors from the global north. And most of the research has been descriptive and cross-sectional. But then it also does not address some of the emerging issues that I talked about. Not only undernutrition, but overnutrition is an important issue to address. Recently, about 3 years ago, there was a study that looked at what is capacity for nutrition programming in West Africa. And it found out that there is insufficient number of nutrition experts in the sub-region. And in many of these countries, about 6 of them, there's actually no degree program training people in nutrition. And for those that have programs, the curricula need to be upgraded. The training is not problem-oriented. It's usually based on the biological aspects of nutrition. The public health aspects is not really there. And then they are often handicapped by infrastructure and logistic needs. The point is that the needs that need to be met are high. Currently, I'm involved in a project in West Africa led by IFPRI that is also trying to understand how evidence is used for decision-making. And one of the things they found in this is that there are some countries that are involved in producing most of the literature that is published, especially Ghana and Nigeria. And then we find that in the French-speaking countries, usually productivity for research and nutrition is lower. Now, I'll give you some experiences of things that I've been involved in that probably gives an idea of what is happening when it comes to how research is happening. So many of us, and in my case particularly, has been very blessed with this document coming out, the Lancet series in nutrition that came out in 2008. because it gave opportunity for the scaling of nutrition movement, and Ghana became a part of it in 2011. But in my work, the way this has been helpful is that it brought some of us researchers in nutrition in Ghana together, starting to work with different partners to generate the kind of local evidence that is needed for the for the SUN movement in Ghana to be able to make some of the decisions that it made. One of the key outcomes of that process is that for a long time we didn't have a nutrition policy, and we were able to make input into that process. But we learned through that process that unless we, the academics, try and deliberately go and engage those who are making decisions, they could actually make decisions without using any local research, which means that there are some gaps that somehow they are overlooking that needed to be addressed. And through that, we found that the SUN movement itself had issues with leadership. How do you bring leadership to make decisions? How do you address issues of conflict of interest? And then the limited capacity to be able to demand and use evidence. And these were challenges that still are with us, but at least we're able to make some input using the kind of research that we were doing. And then in 2014, I met Patrick for the first time through this project. And it changed the way I think, because I used to think that as a researcher, I work and I publish, and then I take a copy of my publication and give it to the Ministry of Health and say, you know, I found this. Now I know better. Because the thing is that part of the work that we did showed that most of the decisions that are being made were based on probably guidelines and decisions that WHO has put together, and then the countries usually would adapt them and then adopt and use in their countries. But we realized that there are gaps in those decisions because they were not also translating it into the local context. And out of that process, I have been able to now have opportunity to work with very many different institutions because of the skills that I learned from that process. I present this also to you as a project that I am currently involved in, which required working with very many different agencies in Ghana. This was based on breastfeeding. But it helped me to understand some of the challenges with how we don't usually collect data, because people are working, they are busy spending time working, but they are not thinking about how do you collect data, how do you make the data easily accessible, which is one of the challenges for research, because if you don't have the data, then you won't be able to make decisions based on that. And then also how it is difficult, even when you have findings, to be able to get funding to make changes. And so, based on the work that we did in evidence, one of the questions we're asking is, what are the barriers to academic research informing the decisions that are made? And there are a few things from that here that I wanted to share with you. I mentioned already that there are budgetary constraints, and therefore there's no research budgets. You know, if you don't have enough money to implement programs, you won't have any to carry out research. There's also poor communication and collaboration between those in the research sector and those who are implementing programs. So there's really no formal opportunity for us to interact. And then there are also differences in the incentives. We are interested in publishing, coming out with our results. They are interested in carrying out programs, and they think we are just doing work that is fit for the shelf. And so we need to figure out how to engage in a useful way. But something that we also quickly learned is that that process requires us to spend time together. We were busy in our corner, they were busy in their corner, and that made it very challenging. And although the SUN movement had led to more funding coming generally into the nutrition sector, it hasn't led to increased funding in the research sector. For example, what do we need research for? What do we need funding for? We need funding for the tools and equipment that we use in research, but also to attract high-quality scientists in terms of collaborations, but also to train students. And then for mobility to interactions like this to be able to engage with others so that we can learn and bring new ideas into the decision-making space where our science gets to. And then there are two slides that I will just briefly talk about the fact that there are also challenges not just with producing science, but making science and decision-making talk to each other. One of the key gaps is the fact that we are not, I mentioned earlier, we are not collecting the data, contextual data that is needed, but also that the quality of the science that is produced locally is challenging, partly because of the earlier issues that I mentioned. The institutions that are producing these scientists are not as strong as they should be. For me, I think this is probably the most interesting, that there's very low demand for research evidence, and then there's no mechanism for the interaction between the researchers and those who make the decisions. There's also limited capacity for those who make decisions to be able to understand it. They don't understand our p-values. They don't understand what you mean by effect size and all that, and we need to break it down for them so that they can understand. And then there's low funding for local research. And then there's also absence of a national nutrition research priority. We don't have anything like that. So if anybody comes to me from the global north and say, we want to do this research, and I haven't got funding from my government to implement any research, I would feel like I would want to get engaged with that person rather than just sit and wait for something to happen. So what opportunities exist for us to be able to overcome these challenges that I've talked about? I think that one of the key opportunities is the fact that the NEPAD and the African Union Commission are beginning to bring these issues up, and it's an opportunity that we need to recognize and engage with. So this is a paper that I mentioned earlier came out, and it recognized the need for research, especially in the area of nutrition and agric, but I think it can apply to other aspects of the nutrition work that we do. And one of the other things to also consider is that now there are these nutrition champions, African leaders for nutrition, that has been established. That is also, I think, a very useful opportunity to plug into, to be able to leverage how to promote nutrition research funding in Africa, but also to promote their ability to make inputs and their championing work based on nutrition research. And then I would end with two more slides to talk about what are, in my own ideas, ways to try and address some of these challenges that we've talked about. I think very easily one of them is to promote North-South partnerships, the kind of thing that Nutrition Third World has promoted, to continue to promote those kinds of things. How to do that, I hope we would all have conversations about. But I think that some of those can be done through functional networks that seek to fill local evidence gaps, and not just the fact that someone has an idea and they want to work on, but it has to be really targeted at filling evidence gaps in the global south. Then also to attract nutrition experts in the diaspora. There are a lot of people who leave the global south, go and study in the north, and they are looking for ways to come back, and sometimes they don't know how to. And in the past, things like re-entry grants have been suggested, but it's not really clear how well those work. And I think we need to explore some of those ideas. And then also, a couple of years ago, I worked with a project funded by the European Commission that looked at mobility grants. And I think possibly that would also be an opportunity to think through how do you promote engagement across North and South. Then the other thing is investment in research. And this morning I was speaking with Carl, and he gave me a very interesting idea about how do you cultivate people in the South who also have funding, but do not know how to, they may not know how to invest in nutrition research. And for me, I think that's a very fascinating idea, and I would like to really engage with anybody who has ideas on that, because we don't also want to only depend on the global north for funding on nutrition research, but we need to also cultivate the ability to be able to do that among those who have the ability to fund those kinds of things in the global south. And finally, build capacity, because as I demonstrated, there's huge gaps, unmet gaps when it comes to capacity, both in the researchers and also in those who are using research output for decision making. So on that note, thank you very much for your attention.
My name is Moses. I come from Kenya. I'm a PhD student at KU Leuven. I want to pay my attention to the last presentation, Professor Richmond. Thank you very much for the insightful, quite engaging, and stimulating, because of the fact that you look fairly young, which is very motivating, and with vast experience. Straight to my point, I want to just give my perceptions about this in the sense of the North-South relationships. And my thinking is we need to strengthen the North-North relationships, then build upon the North-South relationships. That can make a big difference in terms of collaboration, because there's a lot of resource that we have in terms of human resource in academia within African countries. We need to build on that so that, for example, you have people in University of Ghana work with people in universities in Kenya. Sorry, to build capacity in that. Then the second thing on resources, I think we need to look at things in a different perspective. Can we, for example, influence people to get into politics, people in science and research to get into politics, so that they get into the politics and influence political decisions in terms of resource allocation, for example, so that if you can't beat them, you join them. And then you influence decisions from that point. I think it's one way you can look at it. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'm Victoria Fabre. I'm a student at Ghent University. And my question is to all the speakers, I think, to begin to address these questions of capacity building in the South and this relationship between the North and the South. I would like to have your opinion on how right now does the vision differ between what the North is wanting to accomplish with nutrition research as opposed to what the South, or like, for example, in Ghana, like what you're wanting to see with nutrition research and what's been brought to you from the North. So.
Okay, thank you. I'm Eunice Nago from Benin. And my question is to Richmond from Ghana. You talked about, you involved in breastfeeding, a project about breastfeeding, and you highlighted the importance to have a functional system bridging the gap between research and policy making. Could you give us an example of how you manage this when it comes to your project on breastfeeding?
The question, I think some of your statements are really suggestions on how to deal with that. And I think that there are different options that can be looked at, but I really definitely support the idea that there needs to be South-South co-strengthening of each other. I think some of those are happening, and there are even deliberate grants that promote that, but they tend to be discipline dependent. And I think that perhaps if we re-engineer that so that it's focusing not only on particular disciplines, and that's also how nutrition is. It's not just one discipline. There are various aspects to it. Probably we'll be able to make much more, get much more out of it. So Makerere, for example, is one of the universities outside of South Africa that does very well. If scientists are able to work across those institutions and we find a way to facilitate that, that I think will be helpful. As to the question of having going into politics, my wife is here, so I won't talk about that. You can talk to her over the break about that. So what is the difference in terms of the way we think of nutrition challenges in the North and in the South? That was the question you were asking, right? I think that essentially they are not the same because, like I showed, we are facing similar challenges when it comes to nutrition. But there are contextual differences. So, for example, in Ghana, we have both a rapidly growing overnutrition challenge and we have undernutrition still persistent. So the way you address that would not be the same, for example, in a country where the main challenge probably would be overnutrition or a food system that is increasingly becoming more processed food availability, then the approaches will be different. So I think either way, we can learn from each other because some of the challenges that we are beginning to face now have actually been addressed by those in other countries. And so by working together, we don't have to then invent the wheel. So that's what I would say to that. Eunice, your question was on how to work with those who are in decision-making, right? That's a hard question because the answer is also very difficult. And I have spent 2 years between 2016 and 3 years, between 2016 and 2018, trying to work with decision makers. And first of all, they are very busy, so it's very hard to get them. But also you need to really cultivate a real relationship with them, not just as, working relationship. Otherwise, they are being chased by different funders, different donors for different things. And they usually would give more attention to the one who has more funding on the table. And if you are just a mere academic like me and you don't have much money to spend, it's very hard to cultivate that. But I think you also need to come to the table with something that they find useful. I mean, I've always talked on other platforms that one of the things that got me into SUN was to get in there uninvited and just sit in there. But make sure that your contributions count. Then next time they invite you for your opinions. But I think also bringing a solution to something that they've been grappling with. So in this particular breastfeeding intervention, it was to help them recognize what are the gaps. Now, when we showed them the gaps, they didn't like it because they like to believe they are doing very well, But then you also give them solutions on how to address it. Then that way they don't feel too bad about it. It's politics. The one who was asking about politics. It's also a different kind of politics that you play. There was a question on Gates. What is the relationship we have with Gates and funders like that? In my experience, the only relationship I have had with Gates Foundation and big institutions like that is to get funding from them. But beyond that, I don't know other ways in which to cultivate relationships with them. But like someone said, I'm young in my career, so I'm still learning.
Yes, I would like to ask, what about African researchers working directly with civil societies? What potential is there? I know that African diaspora in Belgium, especially entrepreneurs, they've been actively working with local communities. Is there some way of working for researchers? And also about transdisciplinarity, because nutrition cannot be looked in isolation, so there are a lot of questions related to lifestyle choices. So how can we involve other disciplines? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. It was a nice presentation. I wanted to agree with my colleague from Kenya. We had also suggested that if you cannot fight them, join them. But what has happened, for example, in Tanzania, the current president has appointed so many professors from our universities, okay, who have joined now the politics. But I don't know what is wrong with politics. When they join, they don't remember where they came from. That is the problem, and this is, we have seen all these examples. So I can help you in that. We have live examples. At least my colleague Martin, who comes from the same country, he can also, tell that is the truth. There is a problem with politics. I think there's good money there when they forget whatever they were complaining on. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Armando Perez Cueto, and I just want to point out one thing that I consider needs to be discussed in this context, and is sustainability, because we are now facing problems that are completely linked with each other, and maybe it is, or probably not maybe, but they are all related to the ways we eat, the ways we consume, the ways we produce, and so on. And there is going to be more and more challenges from that perspective, because climate change is forcing people out of their places. And if you think which are the coolest places in the world, is either the southern cone of Africa or South America, which are very narrow, or here in Europe. So how are these considerations also made when we are addressing nutrition? A paper in Lancet in January this year made the point that we are in a syndemic where overweight or malnutrition in all these forms are obesity and cardiovascular diseases and so on. They are together with climate change, and they are mutually causal. So I think this is an aspect that needs to be taken into account, particularly when the meat that the people are eating here in Europe is the reason why the forests are burnt in my country of origin, Bolivia. So that's why I would like that to, because I know there are other fires now in Africa and so on, so I would like that to be addressed as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm from Ghent University and Ethiopia Public Health Institute from Ethiopia. My question may be to Professor Patrick, from your experience, to share your experience. Most of their nutrition interventions are targeting to nutrition-specific interventions in Ethiopia, and many countries in in the developing world are focusing on the health aspect only. It is difficult to bring other sectors. As it is a multi-sectoral, it is difficult, really difficult, in case of Ethiopia, to bring the agriculture, the education, the sanitation aspect, all these sectors. Do you have any experience from Europe or from any other countries that are functionally, that brings multi-sectoral nutrition coordinations to success? Maybe that could help us. In Ethiopia, it's really challenging to bring different sectors to work together, and anyone who has a good experience that can share for.
The question about civil societies, there are actually there's a platform of civil societies in Ghana. I don't know about other African countries, but when we started working with the Sun, we started from the university working as a civil society. And we brought together other civil society partners to work together. But then whenever, you bring people from different backgrounds to work together, there's conflict or conflicts of interest. So we had to break off eventually, and then they were working as civil society and we are working from academic. But currently, a new civil society has been put in place that focuses mainly on nutrition, and it supports the Sun work, which is really exciting, and we work very closely with them. They are also facing the same challenges we are facing, funding, and sometimes we help them write grants so that they can get funding to be able to work, but then they also face capacity challenges, and I think these are things that would evolve over time. Regarding transdisciplinarity, this is in many of the projects that I've had opportunity to work with, it's usually with different sectors, and most of my projects are like that. There are ones that we are currently working on, food environments, and we are working with people from public health, nutrition, health, and also social sciences. And it's something that we keep at the back of our minds, because eventually some of the issues we are dealing with are in our agri sector, and we are not trained to be able to deal with that. And so we are constantly learning about who are the best partners to bring to the table so that we can work with. But you're right, it's something that we should always have at the back of our mind when designing nutrition programs. I just want to comment a little bit about the politics issue. I think you mentioned the speaker from Kenya who was supposed to come, Ruth. You know, she's a politician, but she's a nutritionist. So if we probably want to learn any lessons from that, we should talk to Ruth, because she's a very active academician, but was once a minister, you know, or parliamentarian, I think, yeah. So people like that we can learn lessons from. Sustainability, Amando, is it? Yeah. It's not something that in my work currently it's a big part of. But as you were speaking, my mind went to one project that we did that looked at the interactions between agriculture, nutrition, and health. But the funder required us that we demonstrate how we address issues of sustainability. So we made sure that we were planting trees, fruit trees, in the communities that we were working in. But I don't know many projects in my area that focus on, at least in Ghana, on sustainability issues. And I think it's incredibly important, the way things are going now, that we need to look at. So I think in our discussions, we should also focus on that. And then the hardest part, somebody talked about coordination. Yeah, I think that's the hardest thing I have ever tried to work on, and that is bringing together people from different sectors to work together. There's always, again, issues of conflict of interest, but even more fundamental is the functional capacity to coordinate. Many of us are trained to do our science. We are not trained as leaders. And so that skill to be able to bring people together, the politics of making sure that everybody gets a win-win situation out of it, it's a skill that we need to cultivate, but it's not always there. 2 years ago, I did a study for IFPRI, trying to look at why is it that the agric and the nutrition sectors don't always work together. And one of the key things that came out, and this was in selected countries in Africa and Asia, is that one of the key things is that we lack coordination capacity. And I think it's something that we need to teach in our curriculums. How do you bring different people to work together? I'm sure there might be examples and experiences here that we could discuss and learn from. Ask me maybe 10 years time when I've grown a little bit older.
Okay, I just want to add to that, because there was also a question on agenda setting. Now, what I've experienced is when donors in the north start thinking about investing in nutrition, they will organize a meeting and invite nutritionists to come and sit around the table and say, what do you think we should invest in? And of course, everybody will say, well, we propose his line of work, okay? And that is also what trickles down when you talk about Ethiopia. What should we invest in? And as Richmond said, the quick fix solutions. Everybody is looking for a quick fix. I work on vitamin A, I'm going to work on vitamin A. I'm just forgetting all the rest. Right? That is a problem. And also I think is in terms of finding research priorities or also working together, you're not going to do that by putting people around the table and say, let's work together. I think you need a methodology. And what we have been trying to do is, for instance, in planning exercises, we start by analyzing together in a workshop format, all together, what is the problem, what are the determinants, jointly identify what are possible lines of action, and then people start to see how they can actually work together within their sector, still keep their specificity, but contribute to a common goal. And then they get interested and say, oh, can I look at your project? Can I look at what you are doing? I think it's the methodology also. In the beginning, everybody wants to propose his way of thinking, but it's when you see that there is a joint action possible, these personal interests, they go away. And that's a way you can do it. I think it's a methodology you need to get to that.